Hi, Magdalena. Hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Okay. And thank you for joining us. And I mentioned already the importance of urban space, and I think in a way that's quite sort of key to what you might be presenting for us. You are working at the Ministry of Culture in Sweden and had at least, I think it was 8 years with the Swedish organization Public Art Agency, and I think that's your choice to actually discuss and present some of the work you've done in that context. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this. Yes, I will talk about how you can facilitate for artistic development and how you need to change structures and able to make them a harbor and enable the development of artistic practice and especially in relationship to what happens in the public space. And I'm going to start to share with you the first project I did, which ran over 7 years and was called MAP, Mobile Art Production, where the core idea was to invite artists without having a space, but looking at how the artistic idea could be what would lead all the logics in that project. So it would be inviting an artist or having a curatorial concept and developing that step by step and setting up projects with very different content in the place most suited for the project. So in difference to museums, allowing where always the room, one single room or many rooms are shaping the artwork, allowing the artistic concept to shape the artworks. And I'll just share my screen with you here. Whoops, and I will do that here. No, yes, here. So can you see it? Yes. So this is just one example where we collaborated with the Royal Dramatical Theatre in Stockholm, enabled to do a piece which is called Curtain Callers, which is looking at everything behind the scene in a production. And it was a collaboration with Hans Vissidén and the sound composer Jonathan Beppler. So all the sounds of the ironing the clothes and the buttons and everything like that was recorded and later shown in that theatre on a multiple screen installation. And this was, of course, a intrinsic collaboration with that particular theatre, and a way of funding such an independent project was very much by finding different kinds of collaborators. We did a project which was a radio program, which was a fictive story about a South African agent who worked with Sweden, which was a very specific relationship during the ANC period. And that was a collaboration with Digital Public Service Radio and a publishing company, project by Michael Bloom. We also looked at how performative practices don't fit neither in the museum nor in the, or some of them don't fit in the museum or in the theater space. So for instance, Chopin's Heart is a performance about allowing people to be melancholic in a production society. So this is Danuta who would tuck you into bed, or you could go into this sunset where you would dance with someone in the sunset and have a sangria, or you could hold in a glory hole, you could hold someone's hand anonymously. So it's a kind of comfort situation. And this, of course, was impossible to do in a theater with a stage, but also in a normal museum. So this was exploring how you can allow for new kinds of artwork and artistic expressions by adapting the place to the artwork rather than the other way around. Or it would be collective shows or group shows like Street View in Gothenburg around the central street, where you don't actually see at all the complexity of the city. And here it would be, this is a statue by Carl Milles, who was a famous sculptor in Sweden, but also a famous fascist. So he would have this megaphone and he would call out for Mama, Mama, and he would call for his mother. And does cross-sectioning the private in the public space. So how we perform, there's one mode of being in the public space, and when we cross-section that with something private, we look at the people around us with different eyes and maybe see their vulnerability in a different way. one of the projects, you would go into a specific situation and the person would tell you a specific story. So here you would step into this car and this woman would tell you a story about a memory that really meant something. And this was also very much about migration and how you shift from one place to another. So a very intimate situation and allowing people to see other things than we see on the formal surface of the city. This was then collected. A lot of these findings were collected in the anthology Imagining the Audience, where we were looking not at the audience as someone who just to communicate to, but how artists actually imagine, and curators imagine the audience in the process of creating a work, how they step into their minds and how they actually really create those situations of presence, which is maybe one of my key interests in running those projects. How do you create a presence in something which feels anonymous? How do you step through that anonymity and address the human? After 7 years, I was asked to become the head of the Public Art Agency Sweden, and this is a state agency. I would also need to say that state agencies in Sweden are arm's length distant, so there is a lot more freedom than if it's directly in the Ministry of Culture. It's under the Ministry of Culture, but rather independent. And the agency was a very traditional art agency, which means that you do works for state situations, public permanent works. And I was interested to look at what is public art today and what can contemporary art in public space be, to really open all the gates and investigate freely how can we use the resource that we have here in terms of the Public Art Agency and substantial funding in order to unlock potentials for artists. And what I could see was that we had a lot of really, really interesting artists, but the interesting practices didn't have enough funding, or they had none. And we had a lot of permanent public artworks with low quality. And we did not have the kind of engagement that would be possible. So it was a cross-sectioning, I think, of a very traditional public art in terms of permanency, and then looking at the independent scene where artists have for a long time gone out in the street and done things independently, and looking at how can the resources from the public system be channeled into a more creative situation for the arts. And my departure point was, if we created an agency for public art today, what would it look like? What would the practices be? And I think my method has always been to look very carefully at what do artists actually do, not to force them into being social workers or anything like that, but looking at when they already do it and involving them and enabling structures and funding and so forth. One example is Smiling Malm, which was made in 16, just after the refugee crisis, or one of them. Miracle by Santiago Mostin, which was right at the center of Malmö, where there is a very mixed population, asking, is it a miracle that we can be integrated or not? And he was referring to himself. Cecil Schaffer had this beautiful cello concert, but with people in black hoods at the central station. And this is a beautiful piece by Bruno Largomasino. In Sweden, at a port, they cut down all the trees to disenable refugees to step on the boats to England, and he collected the pieces and reconnected them with those copper bands, and in a beautiful way to look at how identity has to be reshaped to adapt to a new situation to be able to enter a country. In the Public Art Agency, there was already a collaboration with other state agencies around the forming of public space with concrete projects in municipalities to look at how can we integrate cultural heritage, social values, art and architecture in socially engaged processes in local neighborhoods. And this is Kerstin Bergendahl, where she looked at the whole area and where they wanted to build new houses, and there was a big conflict, and she talked to all the inhabitants but also with the municipality, and she managed to create a new solution where they would build the houses in a different area. And she also created a kind of social glue in that area. This is an ongoing project that still continues in different versions, but not with her anymore. So this was a very interesting learning, and so it's interesting, how can we continue to work with local initiatives and to engage the social issues and be part of a larger structure. And a couple of years later, we had a special government mission to look at work with art in, it was actually in areas with low voter attendance, but basically in poor areas around Sweden. And this was formulated as a collaboration with groups of civic society. So it was, we had to set up a very specific project where they would apply for a project, and then we would go out there and together with them we would find an artist which would actually be able to do something. And that was a kind of a processual development and really understanding local context. This is a beautiful project by Carla Zaccagnini, and it was an association of parents in a very problematic suburb of Malmö, where there is a lot of drug dealing even openly in the square. And the parents wanted a place for their children to play, and they wanted to transform the public space to be a place for children. So Carla made it those two roundabouts, and when they spin at the same time, they play this anti-fascist song, White Rooster, Black Rooster. And only when the kids kind of do this in sync, there is this beautiful melody coming out in the square. And this has changed the dynamic of the square because it gives space to children, and it's also empowered this group of parents to feel that they can actually change their local situation, even though of course, it's hard for them to change the hard facts of that. And one very important part of doing those projects was to empower the civic society in relationship to, it could be the municipality, it could be an electricity company who would fund the project. It was a huge network of collaborations and funding strategies, but really with the purpose of empowering civic society. Another one of those was a project by the Palestinian architect, Sandi Hilal. And it's in the north of Sweden, a house for refugees. And Sandi herself, having moved to Sweden, recognized the importance of being able to be a host. So she created a living room where anyone could be the host and invite people, because as a refugee, you're always the guest, and you're always, you don't have any way of empowering yourself or feeling at home. But if you create a hostship, that transforms the whole situation of being in a new country. And I think this was also borrowing from a Palestinian tradition where the living room is a mixture of the public and the private space, which we don't really have. We have a very separated space in Sweden. So in a way, she also gave something to the Swedish society as a model of rethinking how we activate, not only through society, but through personal initiatives. So it was also giving something that we didn't have. Or we would use a performance where you walk together with someone with your eyes closed in an area that would normally be seen as bad and boring and ugly because it's a rundown suburb, and then you would see it with different eyes. And this was something which was very strong from the civic society, that they loved their places, even though they were rundown or difficult. They had the love for this place, and how could they make other people see it with other eyes? Because it's a real backdraw to always be looked upon as a venue of problem. So it was a lot of different strategies, and it was extremely important to understand the process, because there was such a difference in power between a state agency and a civic society in every kind of sense, and borrowing and giving away power to that. Embracing conflict, obviously, as you always have to do in public space, thinking as the departure point of a dialogue. Negotiations in all directions. Listening. I think listening is at the core of working in public space and working with art. You find a space, you look at the context, the specific context, and you listen out what can happen here. Maybe this artist, maybe that one. Who is here? What are the stories that we already know? What could be the future? And really being very attentive to what's going on. Empowering leadership, thinking about how you structure and give away power. And of course, as everything with public art and urban space collaboration. A lot of the work we did we also created a lot of permanent works on urban development works on a larger scale, which I won't really have time to go into now. But this was collected in this publication, which is about curating context, the specific knowledge as a curator that you need to have in order to actually step into those processes, and how artistic methodologies can also be adapted into other structures of urban development. For instance, the way of looking at what the human is, what the place is, how artists have an attention to what's already there and the values that are there, which a property developer often overlooks because they say there's nothing in this area, we just have to start anew. Whereas artists have a different way of looking at things. So we try to collect this in the publication in order to, because this is, I mean, I had to train all my curators. We had to really start from the beginning. We brought in an architect. We had to transform the whole organization because it was a bureaucratic organization, procuring curators and procuring artworks in a very static way. And we needed to have the competence in-house, and we needed to create an organization which would be in constant development, where we would learn constantly from what we did. And it was a huge learning curve with everyone involved. And also involving administration and communication to work in a very, very team-based manner, but also with individual artistic responsibility. At the moment, I left the agency about a year ago, while 2 years ago there was a new policy from the state in Sweden, which was about the designed living environment and combining architecture design, cultural heritage, public art, and social dimensions. And I'm going to stop this so I can see you again. Let's see how I do that. So can you see me now? I hope so. This was a new policy to look at how can we be more, in Sweden it's been very separated, so you have the planning and you don't have the way how you actually make the city look, or how you involve people, or how you involve cultural heritage or architecture art in that process. So we're looking at, in terms of sustainability, how can you add the cultural dimensions into the sustainability question? And this is a mission given to 4 agencies, but it's also really implemented in municipalities throughout Sweden. And I would say it's really at its start, because it's quite a difficult and challenging process, because the processes of urban planning has to be changed. But what's really beautiful about it is that it actually sets the human being in the center. So this is lived environments. It's for people who are living in those places. How can we continue to think about places not as production places where people have to go to back and forth for work, but also that when they go to work, they might see something which might make them think differently, or make them act differently, or see their neighbors in a different way. So this is really, it's ongoing, it's rather difficult, and it requires, again, an enormous amount of collaboration and imagination of how can we make those stakeholders in the lived environment involved in different ways. And I would say that my interest here has been, especially running those 2 organizations, but also now to think, in all countries we have different, in Sweden we have a big public sector, but my experience is also that it's really possible to work with property companies, electricity companies, all kinds of institutions could be used if you negotiate well to collect around those things, and then they also become much more sustainable, because you create a common understanding of why it's so important to have space of imagination, or creating really good and inspirational environments and social structures in the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, an exceptional story about actually starting at the back of the back of the stage and reconfiguring that to actually reconfiguring on a more grand scale, and the idea of using the practice of art in public space and connecting with the various agendas and contextualizing things, but then upscaling it to try and see it, how this idea of the lived environment could be seen as almost as a sort of curatorial perspective of trying to re-link and reconnect different aspects of society. So thank you very much for that. And I think we're almost back on time, which is amazing because we were behind. So thank you for keeping time.